And now I would like to invite Ms. Jofi Chan. Jofi Chan is from the grassroots community, and she is a community officer of Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions. She might share with us her personal experience and views on national security law. Ms. Chan, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellency. For those of you who try to understand what happened in Hong Kong and what is actually happening in Hong Kong, I recommend this book called The Other Side of Story, written by Nuri Fatachi. Fatachi is a foreign writer / editor based in Hong Kong. Fatachi reviews the inconvenient truth for much of the audience here. Not that our audience does not have the ability to differentiate between right and wrong, but it's because the authentic side of the story of Hong Kong, sadly, is not often seen in the mainstream media, especially those in English. Before quoting from the book, to let you have a full grasp of how a foreigner perceived the riots in Hong Kong, I would like to first begin with a shocking story, which was reviewed by Fatachi back in December 2019, just to let you know who speaks for the people of Hong Kong. On the 18th of December 2019, Fatachi published an article exposing that a widely quoted anti-China source who uses a Chinese name is actually a Westerner. For more than 5 years leading up to the riots in Hong Kong, a certain Kong Xionggan is frequently cited in the English language press, including the Washington Post of the US, the UK's Guardian, France 24, Deutsche Welle of Germany, etc. This Kong Xionggan, who portrayed himself as a local-born writer, is in fact an American and a former Amnesty International staff member. His real name is Brian Kern. Not to mention, Kern was filmed giving instructions to black-clad rioters, giving rise to the allegations that he was a CIA agent. While it's not illegitimate to publish material under a pen name of different ethnicity, it is reported that Kern fled Hong Kong just before the national security law comes into force on the 30th of June 2020. Maybe he believes that he's guilty under the national security law. But how many more Brian Kern in disguise? We do not know. No one knows why the international language media, which regularly quoted Kern, did not fact-check his identity. Whether intentional or not, no one knows. All we know is the English-speaking audience has been hearing the voice of America speaking as the people of Hong Kong for more than 5 years, and probably for longer had the truth not been revealed. We also know that pretending to be a native Chinese, spreading anti-China messages for more than 5 years worldwide would be more than sufficient in painting this false picture of Hong Kong and China. In Fatachi's new book, there's a chapter named A Brief History of Lies, in which he reviews the sad history of lying about the numbers of protesters and the Western media's biased policy to present as fact whichever lie makes Hong Kong look worse. 2 million was right at the top of almost every report, as the number claimed in one of the Black-clad marches in June 2019. The wider implication is that almost 1 in 3 of all adults in the city share the opinions of the radicals, making Hong Kong look as though it is a monolithic community. But this is not the case. For instance, as Fatachi pointed out, a Hong Kong Baptist University survey earlier found an average passing rate of 4,000 marches every 10 minutes. Given the distance of the march, the total claim figure of 2 million could only have been achieved if everyone had sprinted the entire distance. Not only the speed of the marches is in question, there are also other scientific analysis regarding the density of the march crowd, extrapolating that the number of marches claimed were nothing but wild exaggerations. However, the Western media chose to present only the fantasy number. The New York Times, for example, hilariously stole the form of words from discount shop windows and said that there were up to 2 million protesters in an article dated on the 20th of October 2019. And that's the exact wording from the New York Times. Surely it is rooted in the organizers' incentive to inflate the number of supporters. But what about the Western media and politicians who choose to believe only in the unjustified claim of the Black-clads? Whatever the political agenda, what happens to valuing the truth? During the riots in Hong Kong, we often see every camera pointing in one direction to form this false narrative of police brutality in Hong Kong, and the violent rioters as heroic democracy activists with a noble cause. In the name of democracy and human rights protection, radical rioters in Hong Kong were responsible for many vicious incidents, including vandalizing the liaison office of the central government, storming the Legislative Council, damaging public facilities, beating up a journalist, biting off police fingers, setting an ordinary citizen on fire and killing another with bricks. I was one of the victims too. In October 2019, I was a candidate for a district council election. The right to take part is set out in Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet just because I do not agree with the acts of the rioters, my election campaign office was under violent attack in the run-up to the election. Under the mobilization and the encouragement of my political opponent, black-clad rioters even came to my office and threatened to burn my colleagues and I to death. Throughout the campaign and even after, my whereabouts were tracked and made known on social platforms used by black-clad rioters, and of course, harassment and death threats ensued. Still, these black-clad rioters are glorified in the West and have even been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for 2 years in a row, when in fact these radicals were undermining the fundamental human rights of expression, safety, livelihood of those who refuse to submit to their political demand of Hong Kong independence. With the national security law in place, I feel much safer, and my right to freedom of speech being protected. Whereas there's a need for electoral reform to ensure a fair election, and that the election would not be hijacked by black-clad rioters ever again. If the black-clad rioters were peaceful democracy activists in the eyes of Western journalists and politicians, then by the same standard, those who stormed the US Capitol Hill earlier this year should also be labeled as peaceful democracy activists and be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Why do the US politicians describe the DC riots as insurrection, when the US Speaker Nancy Pelosi once called the Hong Kong riots a beautiful sight to behold? Pelosi also said that the passage of national security law was a brutal, sweeping crackdown against the people of Hong Kong. Who are the people of Hong Kong to which Pelosi is referring? The so-called 2 million people? The American voice behind the Chinese persona, the Brian Kern? Doesn't America have its own national security laws? With the same logic, is America's national security law a brutal, sweeping crackdown against the people of the United States? Let me give you some facts. Since the national security law takes effect on the 30th of June 2020, up to the date of the 16th of February this year, only 98 people have been arrested under the new law. 98 people out of 7 million Hong Kong citizens. This figure clearly illustrates that the national security legislation only targets an extremely small minority of criminals. On the other hand, the United States has the Espionage Act of 1917, National Security Act, National Security Education Act, Homeland Security Act, Protect American Act. The list of US national security laws goes on. Back when I was a child in the 1990s, Western media and politicians mistakenly predicted the death of Hong Kong upon the end of British colonial rule. Headlines of similar predictions return every now and again, in 2003 and so forth. Recently, Western media and politicians take the national security law as foreshadowing the demise of Hong Kong's economic status. A similar deja vu, isn't it? A prominent writer of Hong Kong, Chris Wing-Yin, describes the phenomenon in one of her best-selling books in 2020 as a group of people, rioters, journalists, and politicians alike, being collectively hypnotized. Perhaps this is the best explanation why people are kept being fooled by Western media bias and being manipulated by political agenda. China was once considered as the sleeping giant. By this metaphor, the sleeping giant is now wide awake, helping out the less developed and the less privileged countries with access to COVID-19 vaccines. Please be fair in judging the rise of China. In Hong Kong, only a small minority of people is anti-China and ignorantly seeks foreign intervention into China's internal affairs. And these people do not represent the people of Hong Kong. My humble sharing of the other side and often the untold side of the story of Hong Kong hopes to awaken those who have been hypnotized. But of course, there are always people pretending to be asleep. Thank you very much. And that's my speech.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chan. Ms. Chan, I believe, is a local Hong Konger who grew up in Hong Kong and understands the society, understands the people. And by introducing a book by this Mr. Vitachi, yes, explain how misinformation played a role in Hong Kong. And also she shared with us her personal experience as a victim of violent extremists in Hong Kong, just as a community worker and a grassroots officer helping the communities. So that her presentation helped us a lot in understanding the real situation on the ground in Hong Kong. And I believe that the audience may have more comments for you and more questions for you later on.